A single dad, desperate to feed his kids, boils grass for dinner. But what he doesn't know is the gardener watching him across the street is secretly the billionaire who owns the Whole Foods empire, and he's about to change everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The afternoon sun blazed through the worn curtains of Ethan Reed's small kitchen, casting long shadows across the cracked linoleum floor. His calloused hands gripped the counter as he stared into the nearly empty cupboards, moving aside a lone salt shaker and a half-empty box of tea bags. The pantry told the same story. Barren shelves that once held promises of meals now only collected dust. Ethan's stomach growled, but it wasn't his own hunger that worried him. It was the thought of Mia and Lucas, their young faces bright with trust and hope, waiting for dinner. He could hear them playing in the living room, their laughter a stark contrast to the heaviness in his heart. "Daddy, when's dinner?" Lucas called out, his voice carrying the innocent excitement of a 6-year-old who had never known to worry about where his next meal would come from. "Soon, buddy," Ethan replied, forcing cheerfulness into his voice. "I'm making something special tonight." He turned to the window above the sink, his eyes falling on the small park across the street. The grass there grew wild and green, untamed by the city's maintenance crew. The sight made his throat tight. He'd seen others, immigrants, the homeless, gathering greens there before. He'd always looked away, telling himself he'd never be that desperate. But here he was, grabbing a plastic grocery bag from under the sink. Ethan stepped out into the scorching heat. "I'll be right back, kids," he called over his shoulder. "Stay inside where it's cool." The park grass was coarse under his fingers as he picked through it, selecting the greenest pieces. Each handful felt like admitting defeat, but he kept at it until the bag was full. Back in his kitchen, he washed the grass thoroughly in the sink, the water running clear over the green strands. A pot of water sat on the old stove, beginning to bubble. Ethan added a pinch of salt, one of the few seasonings left in his cupboard, and dropped in the grass. The kitchen filled with an earthy smell that made his eyes sting, though perhaps it wasn't just the grass causing that reaction. "What are you cooking, Dad?" Mia appeared in the doorway, her dark hair falling in messy waves around her face. At 8 years old, she had her mother's observant eyes, and sometimes Ethan worried she saw too much. "It's a special soup," he said, stirring the pot with more confidence than he felt. "Something my grandmother used to make." Mia stepped closer, peering into the pot. "It looks different. That's because it's made with special ingredients," Ethan explained, his voice catching slightly. He cleared his throat. "Why don't you and Lucas wash up for dinner?" While the children were in the bathroom, Ethan ladled the green-tinged water into 3 bowls. The grass had softened somewhat, but it still looked exactly like what it was: boiled lawn clippings. He arranged the bowls carefully on their small table, positioning them in the dimming light where the contents might look more appetizing. "Dinner's ready," he called out, and the sound of running feet filled the house. Lucas bounded into his chair, his face flushed with excitement. "Soup! I love soup." Mia sat down more slowly, her eyes moving from her bowl to her father's face and back again. Ethan took his seat between them, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "This is a very special recipe," he said, his voice steady despite the shame burning in his chest. "It's full of vitamins and good things to help you grow strong." Lucas didn't hesitate, spooning up the green strands and slurping them down. "It tastes like outside," he declared with a giggle. Mia took smaller bites, but she ate without complaint. Her eyes kept finding her father's face, and each time they did, Ethan felt his heart crack a little more. There was understanding in those eyes, too much understanding for a child her age. "Thank you, Daddy," she said softly, reaching over to pat his hand. "It's a nice soup." Ethan watched as his children ate, their trust in him evident in every spoonful they consumed. They didn't question why their dinner was nothing but hot water and grass. They didn't ask about the missing bread or meat or vegetables that should have accompanied their meal. They simply ate what their father had given them, secure in the knowledge that he would take care of them. When they finished, Lucas rubbed his belly. "That was good, Dad. Can we have dessert?" "Not tonight, buddy," Ethan replied, ruffling his son's hair. "But hey, why don't you two go pick out a book? I'll read to you after I clean up." The children scampered off to their shared bedroom, leaving Ethan alone at the table. He stared at his own untouched bowl, the green strands floating listlessly in the water. His hands trembled as he picked up the spoon, and he set it back down without taking a bite. The silence of the kitchen pressed in around him, broken only by the distant sound of his children discussing which book to choose. Ethan dropped his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking with the effort of containing his emotions. The weight of failure sat heavy on his back, crushing him with its intensity. He had always promised himself he would provide for his children, that they would never know the kind of poverty he had grown up with. Yet here he was, feeding them boiled grass and calling it soup. His chest ached with a pain that had nothing to do with hunger. Tomorrow loomed ahead like a dark cloud, full of the same impossible questions. How would he feed them? How would he keep a roof over their heads? How much longer could he maintain this facade of normalcy while their world crumbled around them? "Dad," Lucas called from the bedroom. "We found the perfect book." Ethan quickly wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and took a deep breath. "Coming, buddy," he called back, his voice remarkably steady despite the storm raging in his heart. He sat there for a moment longer, gathering his strength. The bowl sat on the table like evidence of his failure, but his children's voices called to him with complete trust and love. They didn't see the shame in their dinner. They only saw their father, trying his best to take care of them. Ethan remained at the table, his untouched bowl of grass soup growing cold before him, each second weighing heavier than the last as his children's voices drifted from the bedroom, filled with an innocence he desperately wished he could preserve. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as Ethan stepped onto his front porch, his worn work boots dangling from one hand. The small patch of earth he'd tried to cultivate as a garden lay withered before him, the soil cracked and dusty. The few vegetable plants he'd managed to grow were drooping, their leaves yellowed and limp in the intense heat. He set his boots down with a heavy thud and walked over to the garden, kneeling to touch the parched soil. It crumbled between his fingers, bone dry despite his efforts to water it the previous evening. The tomato plants he'd bought on clearance from the hardware store hung lifeless, their stems bent like defeated soldiers. A prickle at the back of his neck made him pause. Someone was watching him. Ethan straightened up slowly, brushing the dirt from his hands onto his jeans. Across the street, an older man stood on the sidewalk, his attention fixed on Ethan's failed garden. He was dressed simply in khaki pants and a light blue button-down shirt, his silver hair neatly trimmed. There was something gentle about his demeanor, despite his obvious interest in Ethan's property. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, feeling exposed. He didn't know many of his neighbors, working multiple jobs left little time for socializing, but he'd seen this man before, working in his own immaculate garden. The contrast between their yards couldn't have been more striking. The man raised his hand in a friendly wave, and before Ethan could decide whether to acknowledge him or retreat inside, he was already crossing the street. His walk was unhurried, purposeful but relaxed, like someone who had all the time in the world. "Good morning," the man called out, his voice warm and steady. "I couldn't help but notice you're having some trouble with your garden." He stopped at the edge of Ethan's yard, maintaining a respectful distance. Ethan's shoulders tensed. The last thing he needed was someone pointing out another failure. "It's fine," he said shortly, reaching for his boots. "I'm heading to work. The soil's your biggest problem," the man continued, as if Ethan hadn't spoken. "This area's got heavy clay content, makes it hard for water to penetrate properly." He took a few steps closer, studying the withered plants. "I'm Arthur Montgomery, by the way. I live in the gray house across the way." Ethan straightened up, his boots still in hand. Despite his instinct to brush off the conversation, there was something about Arthur's manner that made him pause. The man wasn't condescending or pitying. He spoke like someone sharing trade secrets with a colleague. "Ethan Reed," he found himself responding. "And, yeah, nothing seems to grow right here." Arthur nodded thoughtfully. "You know, I've been gardening for decades now. Picked up quite a few tricks along the way." He gestured to the dry soil. "A good compost mix would help retain moisture, and some mulch would keep the roots cool in this heat." Ethan's pride warred with his practical side. The garden had been a desperate attempt to supplement his children's meals, but so far it had yielded nothing but disappointment. "I appreciate the advice," he said carefully, "but I can't afford fancy gardening supplies right now." "I've been living here for a few months," Arthur said, his tone gentle but direct. "I've noticed you and your children." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes the simplest solutions are the best ones. I have extra supplies from my own garden. More than I need, really." Ethan felt his face grow hot. The idea that this stranger had been watching, had seen their struggles, made his stomach clench. "We're doing fine," he said stiffly, even as the memory of last night's grass soup made his throat tight. "Of course," Arthur agreed easily, "but every gardener needs the right tools." He looked at Ethan's yard with genuine interest. "You've got good southern exposure here. With the right amendments to the soil, you could grow quite a lot in this space." The mention of growing food made Ethan hesitate. He thought of Mia and Lucas, their uncomplaining acceptance of whatever he managed to put on the table. If there was a chance to provide them with fresh vegetables. "I know something about growing things," Arthur continued. "Built my whole life around it, you might say." His eyes crinkled with what seemed like a private joke. "I'd be happy to share what I've learned." Ethan studied the older man, trying to understand his motivation. Arthur's clothes were simple but well made. His manner unpretentious, despite the obvious care he took with his appearance. He didn't look like someone who would mock another's hardships. "Why would you want to help?" Ethan asked finally, his voice rough with suspicion. Arthur's smile was warm but held a hint of something deeper, almost sad. "Let's just say I've been where you are, in my own way." Sometimes, the right help at the right time can make all the difference. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the diner's parking lot as Ethan trudged to his car, his feet aching from hours of running between tables. The smell of grease and coffee clung to his uniform, a constant reminder of another day spent barely making enough to survive. His muscles protested as he slid behind the wheel of his old sedan, the leather seats cracked and worn from years of use. Arthur's words from that morning echoed in his mind. The older man's gentle offer of help had seemed genuine, but Ethan had learned the hard way that nothing in life came without strings attached. He rested his forehead against the steering wheel, exhaustion seeping into his bones. The memory of his children eating grass soup twisted his stomach into knots. Mia and Lucas hadn't complained, but their trusting faces had nearly broken him. What kind of father couldn't even provide proper food for his kids? Starting the car, Ethan pulled out of the parking lot, his thoughts still tangled around Arthur's offer. The man seemed different from others who'd offered help before. There had been no pity in his eyes, just a quiet understanding that made Ethan uncomfortable. He'd seen wealthy people's idea of helping before, usually just enough to make themselves feel good while reminding you of your place. The drive home took him past neat rows of houses, each one a reminder of what he couldn't provide for his family. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as he remembered Arthur's well-maintained yard, the obvious signs of comfort and security. The contrast with his own struggling patch of dirt was almost painful. Turning onto his street, Ethan spotted his children playing in the front yard. Lucas was drawing with chalk on the sidewalk while Mia supervised, her protective nature showing even at 8 years old. The sight of them made his chest tight. They deserved so much better than what he could give them. He parked the car and slowly got out, his joints protesting after the long shift. The children's faces lit up when they saw him, and they ran to give him hugs, not minding his greasy uniform or tired appearance. Their unconditional love both warmed and wounded him. "Daddy, look what I drew!" Lucas pointed proudly to a collection of colorful scribbles on the sidewalk. "That's great, buddy." Ethan managed to smile, ruffling his son's hair. "Why don't you both head inside? It's getting late." As the children headed for the house, Ethan's eyes drifted to his failed attempt at a garden. The soil was hard and unyielding, much like life had been lately. He'd tried to grow some vegetables earlier in the spring, but without proper knowledge or tools, the plants had withered and died. The sound of footsteps made him turn. Arthur was approaching from across the street, carrying something in his hands. Ethan straightened his shoulders, fighting the urge to retreat inside. The older man's calm demeanor was somehow more unsettling than if he'd been overtly condescending. "Evening, Ethan," Arthur said, his voice warm but not overly familiar. In his hands were a canvas bag and what looked like a new shovel. "I thought you might be able to use these." Ethan's pride reared up instantly. "I can't accept these are just gathering dust in my shed," Arthur interrupted smoothly, holding out the items. "The seeds need to be planted soon, or they'll go to waste. It seems a shame to let good tools and seeds go unused when there's perfectly good soil right here." The mention of seeds made Ethan's resolve waver. He thought of the empty kitchen cabinets, of his children's trust in him to provide. Still, he couldn't quite bring himself to reach for the offered items. Arthur set them down carefully on the ground between them. "I've been gardening for 40 years, he said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. "Learned everything the hard way. Made every mistake you can imagine. Would have saved myself a lot of trouble if I'd had someone to show me the basics." Ethan found himself looking at the bag of seeds despite his determination to refuse help. "I don't have time for gardening," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Between work and the kids, a garden doesn't need much time once you know what you're doing," Arthur replied. 15 minutes in the morning, maybe the same in the evening. Nature does most of the work. We just have to give it a little help getting started." The simplicity of the statement struck Ethan. He looked at his failed garden patch again, then at the tools Arthur had brought. His children's faces floated in his mind, their brave smiles as they ate the grass soup, their unquestioning faith that he would take care of them. Ethan swallowed hard. "I don't know the first thing about growing vegetables. That's why I'm offering to show you," Arthur said quietly. "No strings attached, Ethan. Just one neighbor helping another." The words, "no strings attached," usually set off warning bells in Ethan's mind. But Arthur's steady gaze held no hidden agenda. After a long moment, Ethan reached down and picked up the shovel. The weight of it felt solid in his hands, real in a way that promises usually didn't. "I can't pay you back," he said gruffly, needing to make that clear. Arthur smiled slightly. "I'm not looking to be paid back. Sometimes helping someone else is its own reward." He gestured to the garden patch. "Shall we take a look at what we're working with?" Ethan nodded reluctantly, still not entirely comfortable with accepting help, but unable to ignore the practical value of what was being offered. He followed Arthur to the small plot of earth, listening as the older man began explaining about soil composition and proper drainage. Inside, his pride still stung, but the weight of the shovel in his hands felt like possibility, and possibility was something he hadn't felt in a very long time. The morning dew sparkled on the tiny green shoots emerging from the dark soil. Ethan knelt beside the small garden plot, his hands covered in earth as he carefully planted another row of seedlings. Arthur stood nearby, demonstrating the proper spacing between each plant. "Not too close together," Arthur explained, his voice gentle and patient. "They need room to breathe and grow." He knelt down beside Ethan, showing him how to create small wells around each plant. "This helps the water reach the roots directly." Ethan nodded, following Arthur's instructions carefully. Despite his initial reluctance, he found himself looking forward to these morning gardening sessions. There was something calming about working with the soil, something hopeful about planting seeds and watching them sprout. "You're getting the hang of it," Arthur commented, standing up and brushing the dirt from his knees. Unlike Ethan's worn work clothes, Arthur wore simple but quality gardening attire. Nothing flashy, just practical and well-made. Day by day, the garden began to take shape. What started as a small patch of tilled earth now showed neat rows of emerging vegetables. Tomato plants stretched their delicate stems toward the sky, while lettuce leaves unfurled in tight, promising clusters. Bean sprouts pushed through the soil like tiny green fingers reaching for the Sunday. Every morning, Arthur appeared like clockwork, carrying different tools or supplies. Sometimes it was a bag of organic fertilizer, other times a new watering can or garden stakes. He never made a big show of these gifts, simply setting them down as if they'd always been meant for Ethan's garden. "The key is consistency," Arthur would say, showing Ethan how to check the soil's moisture or prune away dead leaves. "Plants are like people. They need daily care and attention to thrive." Ethan found himself absorbing every bit of knowledge Arthur shared. He learned about companion planting, how certain vegetables grew better when planted next to each other. He discovered the importance of proper watering schedules and the signs of nutrient deficiency in leaves. Mia and Lucas started joining them in the garden before school, their small hands eager to help. Arthur always had special tasks for them, collecting stones for borders or naming the different plants with handmade signs. Their excitement was contagious, and Ethan couldn't help but smile when Lucas proudly announced each new sprout he discovered. "Look, Dad," Lucas would exclaim, pointing at a tiny green shoot. "Another one came up. That's wonderful, buddy," Ethan would respond, his heart lifting at his son's enthusiasm. One particularly warm afternoon, as they finished up their gardening work, Ethan noticed Arthur sitting on the old wooden bench near the garden. The older man seemed lost in thought, his eyes fixed on the growing plants. Something about his quiet presence made Ethan feel safe, understood. Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans and walked over to the bench. He sat down beside Arthur, the wood creaking slightly under his weight. For a moment, they both sat in comfortable silence, watching the slight breeze rustle through the young plants. "I lost my job at the factory 6 months ago," Ethan said suddenly, surprising himself with the admission. His voice was quiet but steady. Had been there for 8 years. They just closed down one day. No warning, nothing. Arthur didn't speak, just nodded slowly, his eyes still on the garden. The kid's mother left 2 years before that, Ethan continued, the words coming easier now. Said she couldn't handle the responsibility anymore. Just packed up and left. He paused, running a hand through his hair. I've been trying to keep it together since then, working whatever jobs I can find. Diners, cleaning services, anything that'll pay something. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden as Ethan spoke about the endless cycle of bills, the constant worry about food, the nights spent lying awake wondering how he'd make it through another day. He talked about the shame of watching his children eat meals that weren't enough, of having to choose between paying the electric bill and buying new shoes for Mia's growing feet. Arthur listened intently, his presence steady and reassuring. He didn't offer empty platitudes or try to solve everything. He just sat there, bearing witness to Ethan's struggles with a quiet understanding that made it easier for Ethan to keep talking. Sometimes, Ethan admitted, his voice growing hoarse, I feel like I'm failing them. Like no matter how hard I work, it's never enough. He looked down at his dirt-stained hands. That day, you saw me. With the grass soup, that was probably my lowest point. I never thought I'd end up there. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the young plants, and in the distance, they could hear the sound of children playing. Arthur remained silent, his weathered face showing no judgment, only compassion. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow over their small garden, Ethan felt something shift inside him, as if sharing his burden had somehow made it lighter. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk as Ethan trudged home from another exhausting shift at the diner. His feet ached in his worn shoes, and the smell of grease still clung to his clothes. But the thought of seeing his children's faces lifted his spirits. The past week had been different, somehow lighter, since Arthur had helped him start the garden. As he rounded the corner onto his street, the sound of children's laughter reached his ears. Mia and Lucas were playing in the small front yard, their faces bright with joy as they chased each other around the newly tilled garden beds. The sight made him smile, despite his exhaustion. Arthur stood at the white picket fence, watching the children play with grandfatherly affection. In his hands, he held what looked like a small wrapped package. His presence had become such a familiar sight that Ethan almost didn't notice the car parked behind him, a sleek, understated luxury vehicle that somehow seemed both expensive and modest at the same time. But then something caught Ethan's eye. There, on the side of the car, was a logo he knew well, the distinctive green oval of Whole Foods Market. His steps faltered, and a cold feeling settled in his stomach. He blinked hard, thinking perhaps his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. But the logo remained. "Hey there, Ethan," Arthur called out warmly, lifting a hand in greeting. "The kids have been helping me water the garden. They're natural gardeners." Ethan barely heard him. His eyes were fixed on the car, his mind racing. The logo seemed to mock him, a stark reminder of everything he couldn't provide for his family. He'd walked past Whole Foods stores before, looking longingly at the fresh produce he could never afford, feeling like an outsider pressing his nose against the window of a world that wasn't meant for him. "What's this about?" Ethan's voice came out harder than he'd intended, gesturing toward the car. "Is this some kind of joke?" Arthur's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of quiet understanding. He glanced at the car, then back at Ethan. "No joke," he said simply. "I suppose I should have told you sooner." "Told me what?" Ethan demanded, though part of him already knew the answer. His children had stopped playing, sensing the tension in their father's voice. "Mia, Lucas," Arthur called gently to the children. "Why don't you go check on those tomato plants we just watered? Make sure they're standing straight." The children hesitated, looking between their father and Arthur, but then moved toward the garden, whispering to each other. Once they were out of earshot, Arthur turned back to Ethan. "I own Whole Foods," Arthur said quietly, his voice carrying no trace of pride or pretense. "I founded it, built it from the ground up." Ethan took an involuntary step backward, as if Arthur's words had physically pushed him. His mind reeled, trying to reconcile the humble gardener who'd been helping him with the billionaire owner of a massive corporation. The man who'd watched him feed his children boiled grass. "You've been watching me struggle?" Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. Watching my kids go hungry. Was this entertaining for you? Some kind of rich man's hobby? No, Ethan, Arthur replied, his voice remaining steady and kind. That's not it at all. Then what is it? Ethan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Because I don't understand why someone like you would waste time with someone like me unless it was for some kind of entertainment. Arthur set the small package he'd been holding on the fence post and turned to face Ethan fully. Money isn't everything, Ethan. Yes, I've been fortunate in business, but that's not what gives my life meaning. He gestured to the garden, where Mia and Lucas were pretending to inspect the plants while stealing glances at the adults. This does. Helping others, making a real difference in people's lives, not just through a corporation, but through genuine human connection. Ethan stood there, struggling with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to tell Arthur to leave and never come back, to protect what little pride he had left. But another part remembered the hope he'd felt watching the first seeds sprout, the joy in his children's faces as they helped tend the garden. I don't need charity, Ethan managed to say, though his voice wavered slightly. I haven't offered any, Arthur pointed out gently. What I've offered is knowledge, time, and friendship. The same things I'd offer any neighbor, regardless of my bank account or theirs. Ethan looked at the garden, at his children, at the simple tools and seeds Arthur had brought over the past week. Nothing extravagant, nothing that screamed of wealth or charity, just practical things, given with quiet purpose. Why didn't you tell me? Ethan asked, some of the anger seeping out of his voice, replaced by uncertainty. Would you have accepted my help if I had? Arthur's question hung in the air between them. Would you have let me show you how to start this garden if you'd known who I was? Ethan didn't answer, but they both knew the truth. His pride would have prevented him from accepting any help from a billionaire. He would have seen it as pity rather than the simple act of neighborly kindness it was. I don't live for the money, Ethan, Arthur continued, his eyes kind but serious. I live for moments like this, helping neighbors, building communities, making a difference in small but meaningful ways. The company, the success, those are just tools that allow me to do what really matters. Ethan stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling both grateful and embarrassed. Grateful for the help that had given his family hope. Embarrassed that he hadn't recognized the truth about Arthur sooner. The late afternoon sun continued to sink, casting long shadows across the garden where his children played, oblivious to the weight of the moment. The small package still sat on the fence post between them, a physical representation of the choice Ethan now faced to accept Arthur's friendship for what it was, or to let his pride push away someone who genuinely wanted to help. The small garden patch behind Ethan's house had transformed over the past few weeks. Where there had once been only dry, cracked earth, neat rows of tiny green sprouts now pushed through the soil. Ethan stood at the edge of the plot, his work boots covered in fresh dirt, watching as Mia and Lucas carefully watered the delicate plants with their child-sized watering cans. "Daddy, look!" Lucas called out, pointing excitedly at a particularly robust tomato seedling. "This one's getting bigger." Ethan nodded, managing a smile despite the weight in his chest. "That's right, buddy. It's growing strong." The evening sun painted everything in warm, golden light, making even their modest backyard seem magical. The children's laughter echoed off the peeling paint of their small house as they took turns sprinkling water on the plants. It was a peaceful moment, one that should have filled him with joy. But Ethan couldn't shake the image of Arthur's car with that Whole Foods logo. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it there, mocking him. Here he was, struggling to grow a few vegetables, while Arthur had built an empire. The disparity between them felt like a gulf, wider than the Grand Canyon. "Mr. Arthur said the tomatoes will be ready in a few weeks," Mia announced proudly, her 8-year-old face serious with responsibility. "He showed me how to tell when they're ripe." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly at the mention of Arthur's name. The older man had been nothing but kind, patient, and generous with his time and knowledge. Yet knowing now who he really was, a billionaire playing at being a friendly neighbor, made Ethan's pride sting like a fresh wound. He looked around at their small yard, taking in the rickety fence, the patched window screens, the worn outdoor furniture. Everything seemed shabbier now, more obviously inadequate. Arthur probably spent more on garden supplies in a month than Ethan made in a year. Lucas tugged at his pant leg, breaking through his troubled thoughts. "Can we have sandwich tomorrow, Daddy? A real one, with meat?" Mia's eyes lit up at her brother's question. Yeah, can we have cheese too? Like the ones we used to have? The innocent requests hit Ethan like a physical blow. He remembered when making sandwiches for his kids' lunchboxes had been routine, not a luxury. When had simple cheese become something they had to wish for? He knelt down to their level, forcing his voice to stay steady. Tell you what, why don't we talk about what you'd like for dinner tonight? The children exchanged excited glances, their faces glowing with hope. It broke his heart how little it took to make them happy these days. Can we have spaghetti? Mia asked tentatively. With sauce? And meatballs? Lucas added, bouncing on his toes. Ethan swallowed hard, thinking of the nearly empty kitchen cabinets. He thought about Arthur, probably sitting down to a gourmet meal in his mansion right now. The contrast made him feel sick to his stomach. You know what? He said, trying to inject confidence into his voice. I promise you both something better than grass soup soon. Something real. The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. His children's faces lit up with joy. But Ethan's own expression hardened as he realized he had no idea how to keep that promise. The garden would take weeks to produce anything edible, and his next paycheck was already spoken for with bills and rent. He watched as his children returned to tending the garden, their small hands gentle with the fragile plants. They believed in him completely, trusted him to provide for them. But as the evening shadows grew longer, Ethan stood there feeling more inadequate than ever, wondering if he would ever be able to give them the life they deserved. The morning sun cast long shadows across Ethan's small garden as he knelt in the dirt, checking the sprouting vegetables. His phone buzzed in his pocket, an unfamiliar number lighting up the screen. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. Hello, is this Ethan Reed? The voice was familiar, his old supervisor from the factory. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Yes, this is he. Good news, Reed. The factory's reopening next month. We're calling back our best workers, and you're on the list. Full-time position, same benefits as before, plus a signing bonus if you start right away. Ethan's hands trembled as he gripped the phone tighter. The factory job had been good, steady hours, decent pay, health insurance for the kids. Everything he'd been desperate for these past months. Where's the new location? Ethan asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be good. We've moved operations to the industrial district on the other side of town, about an hour's drive from your old place. Ethan's gaze drifted over the tiny green shoots pushing through the soil. The garden he and Arthur had built together was finally showing promise. Mia and Lucas had been so excited watching things grow, spending more time outside instead of worrying about their next meal. Can I have some time to think about it? Ethan asked. You've got until tomorrow afternoon. We need to fill positions quickly. After hanging up, Ethan sat back on his heels, staring at the neat rows of vegetables. The commute would be impossible from here. He'd have to move closer to the factory. His chest tightened at the thought of leaving this neighborhood, leaving Arthur's guidance just when things were starting to improve. He spotted Arthur working in his own garden across the street. The older man looked up and waved, his weathered face creasing into a warm smile. Ethan waved back, then slowly made his way over. Arthur, got a minute? Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Of course. Arthur set down his gardening tools and gestured to 2 chairs on his porch. What's on your mind? Ethan sank into one of the chairs, his thoughts tumbling over each other. The factory called. They're reopening, offering me my old job back. Arthur's eyes brightened. That's wonderful news, isn't it? Yeah, it should be. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. But they've moved to the other side of town. I'd have to relocate. Understanding dawned on Arthur's face. He was quiet for a moment, looking out over their gardens. And you're worried about leaving all this behind? The garden's finally growing. The kids are happier here than they've been in months. Ethan's voice cracked slightly. But this job, it's everything I've been praying for. Steady income, benefits, security. Arthur leaned forward in his chair. You know, Ethan, when I started Whole Foods, I faced similar choices. There were moments when I had to decide between what felt safe and what felt right. This feels different, Ethan said. I've got the kids to think about. I can't just follow my heart when their futures are at stake. No one's saying you shouldn't take the job, Arthur replied gently. But remember, work is just one part of life. It doesn't define who you are or what you can become. Ethan stood up and paced the porch. That's easy to say when you're successful. I've got nothing to fall back on. No savings, no education, just my ability to work hard. And that's not nothing, Ethan. That work ethic, combined with what you've learned here, Arthur gestured to the gardens, those are valuable skills too. Skills that don't pay the bills, Ethan muttered. Not yet, perhaps. Arthur's voice remained calm. But sometimes the safest path isn't the only path. Ethan stopped pacing and gripped the porch railing. The factory job meant stability, something he hadn't had in months. But it also meant long hours away from his kids, leaving their budding garden behind, and losing Arthur's mentorship just when he needed it most. I don't know what to do, Ethan admitted. The logical choice is to take the job. It's what a responsible father would do. A responsible father also considers his children's happiness, Arthur pointed out, and his own. The weight of the decision pressed down on Ethan's shoulders. The factory job represented everything he'd been desperately seeking: financial security, stability, a chance to provide for his family properly. But standing here, looking at the growing garden, and thinking about his children's excited faces as they helped tend it, he felt torn between two worlds. They need me to decide by tomorrow, Ethan said, his voice tight with stress. Arthur stood and placed a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder. Then take tonight to think it through. But remember, Ethan, there's more than one way to build a secure future. Ethan nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead to practical concerns: moving costs, finding a new place to live, leaving behind the small community they'd built here. The security of a steady paycheck pulled at him like a magnet, even as his heart ached at the thought of uprooting his family again. Thanks for listening, Arthur, he said finally, his voice heavy with uncertainty. Whatever you decide, Arthur replied. Know that you're not failing anyone by making the choice you think is best for your family. But as Ethan walked back to his house, he couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what he chose, he would be letting someone down. Either his children by moving them away from this newfound stability, or himself by passing up the security he'd been desperately seeking. The weight of the decision felt like a physical burden, pressing down on his shoulders with each step he took. The factory loomed before Ethan in the pre-dawn darkness, its metal walls stretching toward the sky like a steel giant. The familiar smell of oil and machinery filled his nostrils as he walked through the employee entrance, his old time card number still muscle memory as he punched in. Reed, welcome back, his supervisor Mike called out from across the floor. The man's voice barely carried over the constant hum of machinery. Same station as before. Nothing's changed much. Ethan nodded, making his way to his old spot on the assembly line. He was right. Nothing had changed. The same fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows on the concrete floor. The same rhythmic clanking of machines filled the air. The same tired faces of his coworkers greeted him with slight nods. The first hour wasn't so bad. His hands remembered the motions, checking parts, assembling components, keeping pace with the never-ending line. But by hour 3, his back started to protest. He'd gotten soft during his time away, his muscles no longer used to standing in one position for so long. During his lunch break, Ethan sat alone in the break room, unwrapping the simple sandwich he'd made that morning. His thoughts drifted to his garden, to Arthur's patient guidance, to the peaceful moments spent watching things grow. The harsh overhead lights and metal tables of the break room felt cold in comparison. Just getting through the day, he muttered to himself, forcing down another bite of his sandwich. The afternoon shift dragged on. The repetitive motions became more demanding as fatigue set in. A few times, he nearly missed catching defective parts, his concentration wavering. By the time he punched out, his feet felt like lead weights. The drive home was a blur. He found Mrs. Peterson, their elderly neighbor who'd agreed to watch the kids, dozing in his armchair. Mia and Lucas were already in bed. They were angels, Mrs. Peterson assured him as she gathered her things. They missed you, though. Lucas kept asking when you'd be home. Guilt gnawed at Ethan's stomach as he walked her to the door. He'd left before sunrise and returned well after sunset. His children had spent the entire day without him. The next morning was harder. His muscles protested every movement as he dragged himself out of bed at 4:30 a.m. He forced himself to make breakfast for the kids, even though they wouldn't be up for hours. He left little notes next to their plates. Have a great day. For Mia, and you're my superhero, for Lucas. The factory seemed even louder that second day. The machines more demanding, the floor harder beneath his feet. During his break, he caught himself nodding off, jerking awake just before his head hit the table. His coworkers gave him knowing looks. They'd all been there. By Wednesday, The exhaustion had settled into his bones. His hands shook slightly as he worked the line, and the supervisor had to correct him twice on quality checks. The drive home that evening was dangerous. He caught himself drifting between lanes more than once. Thursday morning, Ethan barely recognized himself in the bathroom mirror. Dark circles had formed under his eyes, and his face looked gaunt. He splashed cold water on his face, trying to wake up. As he made the kids' lunches, he dropped a jar of peanut butter, the glass shattering on the floor. "Dad!" Mia's voice came from the doorway. She stood there in her pajamas, looking worried. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart," he managed, forcing a smile. "Just a little clumsy this morning. Go back to bed. You've got another hour before school." But she didn't move. "You look really tired." "It's just taking some time to get used to the new schedule," he assured her, carefully sweeping up the glass. "Don't worry about me." At work that day, the machines seemed to move faster than ever. Ethan's vision blurred occasionally, and he had to blink hard to focus. During his lunch break, he fell asleep sitting up, only waking when another worker accidentally bumped his table. Friday was the worst. Every step felt like walking through mud. His joints ached, his back screamed in protest, and his head pounded with each clang of the machinery. He made 3 mistakes on the line that morning, earning a stern warning from the supervisor. "Get it together, Reed," Mike had said, frowning. "We can't afford errors like this." The paycheck that arrived at the end of his shift was decent, better than anything he'd made since losing his job the first time. But as Ethan drove home that evening, his entire body screaming in protest at every movement, he wondered about the cost. He barely managed to thank Mrs. Peterson before she left. The house was quiet, his children already asleep again. He hadn't seen them awake since Wednesday morning. Ethan's bedroom felt miles away as he trudged down the hallway. He didn't even bother changing his clothes, just kicked off his boots and collapsed onto his bed. Every muscle in his body ached, and his hands trembled even as he lay still. The ceiling spun slightly above him as exhaustion pulled at his consciousness. The decent money in his pocket felt like a poor trade for the toll this week had taken on his body. As sleep finally claimed him, his last thought was of his small garden, probably wilting now from neglect, and of Arthur's patient, knowing eyes. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Ethan's small garden as he trudged up his driveway. His work boots felt heavier than usual, and his shoulders ached from 12 hours of repetitive motions at the assembly line. The garden caught his eye. Tomato plants heavy with fruit, green beans climbing their trellises, and neat rows of lettuce spreading their leaves toward the fading light. Lucas and Mia were playing near the fence, their laughter a stark contrast to his exhaustion. They barely looked up as he passed, too engrossed in their game. It hadn't always been like this. Just a week ago, they would have run to greet him, eager to show him how the plants had grown during the day. "Daddy, look!" Mia finally called out, pointing to a cluster of bright red tomatoes. "Mr. Montgomery helped us water everything this morning. He said they're ready to pick." Ethan's jaw tightened at the mention of Arthur's name. The thought of someone else tending to his garden, his responsibility, stirred something uncomfortable in his chest. "That's nice, honey," he managed, his voice flat. "I'll look at them later." Inside the house, he found a note on the kitchen counter in Arthur's neat handwriting. The children helped harvest some vegetables for dinner. "They're in the refrigerator. Call if you need anything." Next to it sat his phone, showing 3 missed calls from Arthur. Ethan crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. The paycheck in his pocket felt like a lead weight. Good money, but at what cost? His hands were too tired to cook, too tired to garden, too tired to even hug his children properly. The next morning, his alarm blared at 4:30 a.m. Ethan's muscles protested as he rolled out of bed, every movement a reminder of yesterday's labor. Through the window, he could see the garden in the dim, pre-dawn light. A few weeds had sprouted between the rows. Nothing serious, but they needed attention. "Later," he muttered to himself, pulling on his work clothes. "I'll get to it later." But later never seemed to come. Each day followed the same grinding pattern. Wake before sunrise, work until sunset, come home too exhausted to do anything but eat and sleep. The factory's demands were relentless, and Ethan pushed himself harder, volunteering for overtime whenever it was offered. His phone buzzed during his lunch break. Arthur again. Ethan stared at the screen, his sandwich forgotten. The old man had left several voicemails over the past few days, each one gentle but concerned. Ethan couldn't bring himself to listen to them. Instead, he silenced his phone and returned to the assembly line. That evening, he found Mia and Lucas sitting with Arthur on the front porch. They were sorting through a basket of fresh vegetables, their small hands carefully selecting the best ones for dinner. The sight should have warmed his heart, but instead, it filled him with a mixture of shame and resentment. "Ethan," Arthur called out, rising from his chair, "we missed you at the garden today. The children have been learning about—" "I've been working." Ethan cut him off, his voice sharper than intended. "Some of us have to earn our living." The words hung in the air like smoke. Arthur's face remained calm, but his eyes showed hurt. The children looked between the two men, confusion clear on their faces. "Daddy," Lucas said quietly, "we picked some carrots. They looked just like the ones from the store." Ethan forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's great, buddy. Why don't you two go wash up for dinner?" He waited until they were inside before turning back to Arthur. "Look, I appreciate everything you've done, but I need to focus on my job now. It's steady work. Good pay." Arthur nodded slowly. "Money isn't everything, Ethan. What you built here, what I built here doesn't pay the bills," Ethan interrupted. "The garden was nice, but it was just a temporary solution. I need something real, something reliable." "The garden is real," Arthur replied softly. "What about the children? They've been thriving here, learning. They need a father who can provide for them," Ethan said firmly. "Not someone playing in the dirt all day." The words tasted bitter in his mouth, but he forced himself to continue. "I'm picking up extra shifts at the factory, double overtime on weekends. I won't have much time for this." He gestured vaguely at the garden. Arthur's expression remained gentle, but his voice carried a note of sadness. "You're making a choice, Ethan. I just hope you're choosing what truly matters." Ethan turned away, unable to meet the older man's gaze. "I know exactly what matters. My kids need stability, not charity." That night, after microwaving a frozen dinner and barely touching it, Ethan sat at his kitchen table. Through the window, he could see the garden in the moonlight. The tomato plants needed staking, and the beans were ready for picking. His phone buzzed again, another call from Arthur. Ethan reached over and turned the phone face down. Tomorrow was another early shift, and he'd volunteered for overtime again. The garden would have to wait. Everything would have to wait. He told himself this was the right choice, the responsible choice. The factory job meant regular paychecks, health insurance, stability. He ignored the voice in his head that reminded him how his children's faces had lit up when they showed him their first homegrown tomato. He pushed aside the memory of peaceful mornings spent with Arthur, learning about soil and seasons. Instead, he focused on the numbers in his bank account, slowly growing with each punishing shift at the factory. The next morning, before leaving for work, Ethan wrote a note to his children. "Working late again. Dinner in the freezer. Love, Dad." He glanced at the garden one last time, then turned away. The factory was calling, and he had chosen his path. The factory floor hummed with the rhythmic clanking of machinery. Metal parts moved along conveyor belts like a mechanical river, endless and demanding. Ethan's hands moved automatically, his mind dulled by the repetitive motion of securing bolts and checking alignments. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows, making everything look bleached and artificial. 8 hours into his shift, fatigue had settled deep into his bones. His back ached from standing in the same position, and his fingers were stiff from gripping tools. The factory had changed since he'd last worked here. New machines, faster quotas, fewer breaks. Everything was about efficiency now. "Reed!" his supervisor shouted over the din. "Need those parts moved to Station B before lunch." Ethan nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. He made his way to a pile of heavy metal components that needed relocating. The proper thing would have been to wait for the forklift, but they were behind schedule, and he couldn't afford to lose this job. Not with 2 hungry kids at home. The first few loads went fine. "Lift with your legs," his father had always said. But as he hefted another batch of parts, something went wrong. His foot caught on an uneven section of the concrete floor. Time seemed to slow as he lost his balance. The weight in his arms shifted, pulling him sideways. He tried to correct his stance, but his body twisted awkwardly. The crack in his back was audible even over the factory noise. Pain exploded through his lower spine like lightning. The parts clattered to the floor, scattering across the concrete. Ethan followed them down, his legs giving out beneath him. He lay there, gasping, unable to move. "Man down!" someone yelled. "Get the first aid kit!" Faces appeared above him. Concerned co-workers, his angry supervisor, the factory's medical officer. Their voices seemed to come from far away, muffled by the roaring in his ears. "Don't move him," the medical officer instructed. "Call an ambulance." The next few hours passed in a blur of pain and humiliation. The ambulance ride, the emergency room's harsh lights, X-rays, and doctors with concerned faces. Through it all, Ethan could only think about his children, waiting at home with the elderly neighbor who watched them after school. "Severe lumbar strain," the doctor finally announced, looking at his chart. "You're lucky it wasn't worse, but you'll need at least 6 weeks of rest. No heavy lifting, no factory work." The words hit harder than the fall had. 6 weeks. No work, no paycheck. "There has to be something else," Ethan pleaded, trying to sit up despite the pain. "Light duty, maybe? Desk work?" The doctor shook his head. "The risk of further injury is too high. You need complete rest to heal properly." They discharged him with a prescription for pain medication he couldn't afford, a back brace he had to charge to his nearly maxed-out credit card, and paperwork for temporary disability that wouldn't cover half his expenses. The taxi ride home, another expense he couldn't afford, felt like a journey into darkness. Each bump in the road sent waves of pain through his back, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the weight of failure pressing down on his chest. When the taxi pulled up to his small house, Ethan could see Mia and Lucas peering through the front window. Their faces lit up at the sight of him, then quickly changed to concern when they saw him struggling to get out of the car. "Daddy!" Lucas called out, running to help. "Careful," Mia warned, holding her little brother back. Even at 8, she had an innate understanding of when things were serious. Ethan made his way slowly up the walkway, each step a reminder of his new limitations. The elderly neighbor who'd been watching the kids met him at the door, her face creased with worry. "The hospital called," she said softly. "Do you need anything?" He shook his head, unable to accept one more kindness he couldn't repay. After she left, Ethan sank carefully onto the worn living room couch, his children hovering nearby. "Are you okay, Daddy?" Mia asked, her small hand finding his. Lucas climbed onto the couch next to him, careful not to jostle too much. "Did you get hurt at work?" Ethan looked at their worried faces. These precious children who depended on him for everything. How could he tell them that their father had failed them again? That the job he'd been so sure would solve their problems was now another dead end? "I hurt my back," he said finally, his voice rough. "The doctor says I can't work for a while." "That's okay," Lucas said brightly. "You can stay home with us, and we can help take care of you," Mia added, squeezing his hand. "I know how to make soup now. Mr. Montgomery showed me with the vegetables from our garden." The mention of Arthur Montgomery and the garden, both of which he'd been neglecting, made Ethan's throat tight. He'd been so focused on proving he could make it on his own, he'd pushed away the people trying to help him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not sure if he was apologizing to his children or himself. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be sad, Daddy," Lucas said, carefully wrapping his small arms around Ethan's neck. "We love you." Mia joined the hug from his other side, and Ethan felt his eyes burn with unshed tears. Here he was, broken and useless, and still his children looked at him with nothing but love and trust in their eyes. His pride, the thing he'd clung to so desperately, felt hollow now. What good was pride when it kept him from accepting help his family desperately needed? What was he teaching his children by refusing to lean on others when times were hard? The pain in his back throbbed, a constant reminder of how quickly everything could fall apart. The medical bills would start arriving soon. The rent was due in 2 weeks. The kitchen cupboards were already getting bare. All his careful plans, all his determination to make it on his own, had crumbled with a single misstep on a factory floor. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through Ethan's living room window. He sat in his worn armchair, grimacing as he tried to find a comfortable position for his injured back. The doctor's words still echoed in his mind. No heavy lifting for at least 6 weeks. 6 weeks without work meant 6 weeks without pay. The thought made his stomach churn. A gentle knock at the door startled him. Mia, who had been coloring quietly at the coffee table, jumped up. I'll get it, Dad! Wait, sweetie. Let me. Ethan started to rise, but winced at the sharp pain that shot through his back. It's okay. It's just Mr. Montgomery, Mia called out as she peeked through the window. She opened the door, revealing Arthur's concerned face. Hello, Mia, Arthur said warmly. May I come in and speak with your father? Ethan's pride urged him to send Arthur away, but he couldn't bring himself to be rude in front of his daughter. It's all right, Mia. Why don't you go check on Lucas? Mia nodded and skipped down the hallway to her brother's room. Arthur stepped inside, his eyes taking in Ethan's rigid posture and pained expression. I heard about what happened at the factory, Arthur said, settling into the chair across from Ethan. How bad is it? Bad enough, Ethan admitted, his voice tight. 6 weeks recovery, minimum. No heavy lifting. Arthur nodded thoughtfully, his weathered hands clasped in his lap. You know, Ethan, I've been watching how you've tended that garden these past few weeks. Even with your factory schedule, you managed to keep it thriving. Ethan glanced out the window at the small garden plot. The tomato plants were heavy with green fruit, and the beans climbed their stakes, reaching for the sky. Fat lot of good that does me now. Can't even bend down to pull a weed. Perhaps this is an opportunity rather than a setback, Arthur said carefully. I've been thinking about something. You have a natural talent for growing things, Ethan. The way you've learned and adapted, it's impressive. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, both from the pain and the praise. I just did what you taught me. No, Arthur shook his head. You did more than that. You took what I showed you and made it your own. That's why I want to propose something to you. The room grew quiet, except for the distant sound of children's laughter from down the hall. Ethan waited, his guard up, but his curiosity piqued. I want to help you start your own business, Arthur continued. Not a handout, an opportunity, a gardening and landscaping service. You'd be your own boss, set your own hours. And while your back heals, you could focus on the planning and lighter work, maybe hire some help for the heavy lifting. Ethan stared at Arthur, waiting for the catch. I don't have any money to start a business, and I don't know the first thing about running one. Arthur leaned forward, his eyes bright with purpose. That's where I come in. I can teach you the business side, just like I taught you about gardening. As for startup costs, we can work something out. Maybe a small loan that you pay back as the business grows. Why? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do this for me? Arthur was quiet for a moment, his expression softening. Because I see in you what I once was. Someone who needs a chance. Not charity. Someone who has the drive but lacks the opportunity. He paused, looking around the modest living room. And because I've learned that success means nothing if we don't use it to lift others up, Ethan felt his throat tighten. The offer was more than he could have hoped for, but his mind raced with doubts. I've never succeeded at anything like this before. What if I fail? Then you'll have learned something valuable, Arthur replied simply. But I don't think you will fail. I've built my business by recognizing potential in people, Ethan. You have it, in spades. The sound of small feet padding down the hallway drew their attention. Lucas appeared in the doorway, clutching a piece of paper. Dad, look what I drew! Ethan managed a smile as his son proudly displayed a crayon drawing of their garden, complete with stick figures of the family tending to impossibly large vegetables. Arthur smiled at the artwork. You see, Arthur said softly. Your children already see you as someone who can make things grow. Maybe it's time you saw that in yourself, too. Ethan looked at the drawing, then at his son's hopeful face, and finally at Arthur. The weight of the opportunity pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. Part of him wanted to refuse, to protect himself from the possibility of failure. But another part, the part that had learned to nurture seeds into plants, the part that wanted more for his children, that part wanted to say yes. Ethan started, his voice catching. He cleared his throat and tried again. I don't know if I can do this, Arthur, but I'm willing to try. Arthur's face broke into a warm smile. That's all I'm asking for. We'll start small, build it step by step, just like that garden out there. Lucas climbed onto the arm of Ethan's chair, careful not to bump his father's back. Can I help with the business too, Dad? Ethan pulled his son close, feeling a mix of fear and hope swirling in his chest. We'll see, buddy, we'll see. Arthur stood up, his movement deliberate and purposeful. Get some rest tonight, Ethan. Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, We can start planning. There's a lot to discuss, but we'll take it one day at a time." Ethan nodded, still overwhelmed by the offer but feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. The possibility of a future he could build with his own hands, even if those hands needed help to get started. The morning dew glistened on the grass as Ethan carefully arranged his tools in the back of his old pickup truck. His back still ached, but the sharp pain had dulled to a manageable throb. Arthur had helped him modify his gardening techniques, showing him ways to work that wouldn't strain his injury. "Remember," Arthur's words echoed in his mind, "smart work beats hard work every time." Ethan checked his phone, reviewing the day's schedule. 3 lawn maintenance jobs and 1 garden consultation. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Arthur had helped him print business cards and set up a simple website, teaching him the basics of running a small business. "Dad, don't forget your water bottle," Mia called out, running from the house with Lucas trailing behind her. She handed him a worn blue thermos, her face beaming with pride. "Thanks, sweetie," Ethan smiled, touched by his daughter's thoughtfulness. The kids seemed different lately, happier, more secure. They loved helping in their home garden, which had become a sort of showcase for potential clients. His first stop was Mrs. Peterson's house, 2 blocks over. The elderly woman had been skeptical at first, but Arthur's recommendation had convinced her to give Ethan a chance. Now, 3 weeks later, her front yard was transforming into a colorful array of flowers and neat shrubs. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," Mrs. Peterson waved from her porch. "The roses are absolutely thriving. My bridge club ladies can't stop talking about them." Ethan felt a surge of pride as he surveyed his work. The roses indeed looked beautiful, their pink blooms adding a splash of color to the previously dull yard. Word of mouth was spreading, and more neighbors were beginning to notice. By midday, Ethan had completed 2 jobs and was heading to his consultation. The sun beat down, but he didn't mind. This work felt different from the factory. It was creative, rewarding, and most importantly, his own. Arthur met him at the next house, a modest home with potential for a beautiful garden. They had fallen into a comfortable routine. Arthur would accompany Ethan on consultations, lending his expertise while gradually stepping back to let Ethan take the lead. "The key is to listen to what they want," Arthur reminded him quietly as they waited for the homeowner. "But also to hear what they're not saying. Sometimes people don't know exactly what they need until you show them the possibilities." The consultation went well. The homeowner, impressed by Ethan's knowledge and Arthur's subtle endorsement, signed up for a complete garden makeover. It would be Ethan's biggest project yet. Back home, Ethan spent the afternoon in his own garden, which had evolved from a simple vegetable patch into a stunning display of both ornamental and edible plants. Local kids often stopped by after school, fascinated by the butterflies that visited the flowering herbs. Lucas had become quite the expert at identifying different vegetables, proudly giving impromptu tours to anyone who showed interest. "Look, Dad," Lucas pointed excitedly to a cluster of tomatoes. "They're turning red just like you said they would." Ethan knelt beside his son, ignoring the slight twinge in his back. "That's right, buddy. Remember what we learned about ripening? The sun helps them grow." Lucas beamed, repeating the simple lesson Ethan had taught him. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan reviewed his accounts at the small desk he'd set up in the corner of the living room. The numbers were modest but growing steadily. He'd managed to pay his bills on time this month, and there was even a little left over. The relief of not living paycheck to paycheck was immense. Mia sat nearby, doing her homework and occasionally asking questions about the business. She'd taken to helping him with simple paperwork, showing a surprising aptitude for organization. "Dad, Mrs. Johnson called while you were out. She wants to know if you can add some herbs to her garden next week." "Thanks, sweetheart." Ethan made a note in his calendar. The business was growing organically, much like his gardens. Each satisfied customer led to new referrals, creating a network of support throughout the neighborhood. That evening, as the sun set, Ethan stood in his backyard, surveying what he'd built. The garden that had started as a desperate measure to feed his family had blossomed into something more. The neat rows of vegetables, the flourishing flower beds, the small greenhouse Arthur had helped him construct, it was all proof that change was possible. His phone buzzed with another inquiry about services. Looking at the message, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: genuine optimism about the future. He wasn't just scraping by anymore. He was building something meaningful, something that could grow and sustain his family. Inside, he could hear Mia and Lucas chatting happily as they set the table for dinner. The evening's meal would include fresh vegetables from their own garden, not out of desperation this time, but by choice. The pride he felt wasn't the brittle defensive kind from before. This was different, steady, grounded, and real. Arthur had shown him that success wasn't just about money. It was about creating value, both for himself and others. Each garden he tended, each yard he transformed, added beauty and life to the neighborhood. People were starting to recognize him not as the struggling single father, but as a skilled professional who could help bring their outdoor spaces to life. Ethan walked through his garden one last time before heading inside, touching the leaves of the plants he'd grown from seed. Each one represented a small victory, a step forward from those dark days of boiling grass for soup. He wasn't just providing for his children anymore. He was showing them how to build something lasting, how to nurture growth in all its forms. The sense of accomplishment filled his chest as he watched a hummingbird visit the flowering vines he'd planted along the fence. This garden, once a symbol of his desperation, had become the foundation of a new life, one he had built with his own hands, guided by wisdom and friendship, and sustained by hope. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine lawn of the Davidson estate. Ethan stood at the edge of the sprawling property, his work boots planted firmly on the ground, taking in the challenge before him. This wasn't just another small garden job. The Davidsons wanted their entire backyard transformed into a peaceful retreat, complete with flower beds, a rock garden, and winding paths. "It's bigger than our whole yard," Lucas whispered, his small hand clutching Ethan's work pants. Ethan smiled down at his son. "Sure is, buddy, but we can handle it." He ruffled Lucas's hair, trying to project more confidence than he felt. This was his biggest job yet, more than triple what he usually made in a month. Mia stood nearby, already wearing the small gardening gloves Arthur had given her. "Can we really help, Dad? For real?" "You bet," Ethan said, pulling out his notebook where he'd sketched the design. Arthur had helped him plan it out, showing him how to break down the big project into manageable pieces. "You two are my official flower planters and stone arrangers." The kids beamed with pride. It warmed Ethan's heart to see them excited about work rather than worried about their next meal. Those dark days of serving grass soup felt like a lifetime ago. Ethan started with the heavy work while the morning was still cool. His back twinged as he operated the small tiller he'd borrowed from Arthur. But he'd learned to pace himself. The rich earth turned over easily, revealing dark soil perfect for planting. "Remember what Arthur taught us," he called out to Mia, who was carefully spacing flower bulbs along the marked line. 3 inches deep for the tulips." "I know, Dad." She measured each hole carefully with the ruler they'd painted with bright colors. "Lucas is doing great with the stones, too." His son had taken to arranging the smooth river rocks with surprising artistic flair. Even at 6, Lucas showed a natural eye for pattern and design. He created a winding path of alternating light and dark stones that looked better than Ethan's original plan. Throughout the morning, Ethan moved methodically through his checklist. Install the irrigation system, grade the soil, layer the mulch. Each task completed brought him closer to proving himself worthy of this opportunity. Mrs. Davidson came out mid-morning with a tray of lemonade and cookies. "Oh my," she exclaimed, surveying their progress. "It's already looking wonderful, and your children are so helpful." Ethan straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Thank you, ma'am. They're learning the trade early." "Just like their father," she smiled warmly. "Arthur spoke very highly of your work ethic when he recommended you." Pride swelled in Ethan's chest, followed by a wave of gratitude. Arthur had become more than just a mentor. He was the first person in years to see Ethan's potential rather than his circumstances. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as they continued their work. Ethan showed Mia how to properly plant the flowering shrubs, explaining the importance of loose soil around the roots. Lucas helped spread mulch, his small wheelbarrow making countless trips across the yard. "Look, Dad," Mia called out, pointing to a butterfly that had already found its way to one of their newly planted butterfly bushes. "It's working." Ethan paused in his work, taking in the sight of his children's joy. This wasn't just about creating a beautiful garden, it was about building a future, one plant at a time. By late afternoon, the transformation was nearly complete. The once empty yard now featured graceful curves of flower beds, neat paths lined with Lucas's carefully arranged stones, and clusters of native plants that would attract birds and butterflies. The irrigation system hummed quietly, providing life-giving water to their new creation. Mr. Davidson arrived home from work just as Ethan was putting the finishing touches on the rock garden. The businessman walked the entire property, nodding appreciatively at each detail. "This exceeds all our expectations, Mr." Davidson said, extending his hand to Ethan. "Arthur said you were the right person for the job, but this is exceptional work." Ethan shook his hand firmly, standing tall despite his aching muscles. "Thank you, sir. We put our hearts into it." "We can tell," Mrs. Davidson added, smiling at Mia and Lucas. "The children's stone path is absolutely charming. Have you considered taking on more large projects like this?" "Yes, ma'am," Ethan replied, his confidence growing. "This is exactly the kind of work I want to specialize in." As they packed up their tools, Ethan watched his children taking final proud looks at their work. Mia was explaining to Lucas how the flowers would bloom in different seasons, repeating the lessons Arthur had taught them all. The check in Ethan's pocket represented more than just payment for a job well done. It was validation that he could build something meaningful, something beautiful, something that would last. His hands might be calloused and his back sore, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was truly providing for his family, not just surviving, but creating a legacy his children could be proud of. Looking at the transformed garden, Ethan felt a deep sense of satisfaction settle in his chest. This wasn't just landscaping, it was art, it was care, it was proof that he could rise above his circumstances. The pride he felt wasn't the stubborn, defensive kind that had once held him back. This was different. This was earned through honest work and dedication. The sweet scent of freshly cut grass filled the air as Ethan guided his lawnmower in neat rows across Mrs. Peterson's front yard. His business had grown from that first big job at the Davidson estate, and now he had regular clients throughout the neighborhood. The satisfaction of watching his work take shape, 1 yard at a time, never got old. "Dad, look what I found." Lucas came running from behind a flowering bush, his hands cupped together. At 8 years old now, his enthusiasm for helping his father work hadn't diminished one bit. He opened his palms to reveal a bright blue robin's egg. "Careful with that, buddy," Ethan said, turning off the mower. "We should put it back where you found it." Mia appeared from around the corner, carrying a basket of weeds she'd pulled from the flower bed. At 10, she had become quite the gardener herself, often spending hours helping Ethan plan new layouts for their clients' yards. "I know where the nest is," she said, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. "I've been watching the mother bird all morning." Ethan's chest swelled with pride as he watched his children work together to return the egg to its nest. There was a time, not so long ago, when he couldn't imagine providing them with anything more than boiled grass soup. Now, they were learning the value of hard work and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful. "Great job with those weeds, Mia," Ethan called out as he started the mower again. She beamed at him, her smile bright enough to rival the morning Sunday. These moments, working side by side with his children, made every struggle worth it. As the morning wore on, more clients stopped by to chat and admire their work. Mrs. Peterson brought out cold lemonade and cookies, which the children accepted with polite thank yous. Another change Ethan noticed with pride. They were growing more confident, more sure of themselves. "Your daddy's done wonders with my garden," Mrs. Peterson told the children, her eyes twinkling. "I've never seen my roses look so beautiful." Lucas puffed up his chest. "I helped plant those, and I designed the color scheme," Mia added, not to be outdone. Ethan watched the exchange from where he was trimming hedges, his heart full. The business wasn't just supporting them financially anymore. It was teaching his children valuable lessons about responsibility, creativity, and the rewards of honest work. By early afternoon, they'd finished at Mrs. Peterson's and moved on to their next job. Arthur occasionally dropped by to check on their progress, but these days, his visits were more social than supervisory. Ethan had found his rhythm, developing his own techniques and solutions to landscaping challenges. "Dad," Mia called out as they loaded tools into their truck, "can we stop by the grocery store on the way home? I want to try making that pasta dish we saw on TV." There was a time when such a request would have filled Ethan with dread and shame. Now he smiled and nodded. "Sure thing, sweetheart. We've earned ourselves a good dinner." At the store, the children helped him pick out fresh ingredients. Lucas insisted on carrying the basket, though it was almost as big as he was, while Mia carefully selected the ripest tomatoes and freshest basil. They moved through the aisles with purpose, no longer having to count pennies or put items back because they couldn't afford them. Back home, their small kitchen came alive with activity. Mia stood on a step stool at the counter, carefully chopping vegetables under Ethan's watchful eye. Lucas set the table, making sure each place setting was perfect. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the air, replacing the memory of that desperate afternoon when grass soup was all Ethan could offer. "Can I stir the sauce?" Lucas asked, bouncing on his toes. "Here, buddy." Ethan lifted him up to reach the stove safely. Nice and slow, just like we're raking leaves. Mia giggled at the comparison. "Everything's like gardening with you, Dad." "Because gardening taught us the most important things, didn't it?" Ethan said, helping Lucas down. "Patience, care, and that good things take time to grow." The pasta came together beautifully, and soon they were sitting down together at their small kitchen table. Ethan looked at his children's faces, illuminated by the warm evening light streaming through the window. Lucas was already twirling spaghetti around his fork, while Mia carefully sprinkled extra cheese on her portion. This was more than just dinner. It was a celebration of how far they'd come. The worry lines that had once been permanently etched on Ethan's face had softened. His hands, though still calloused from work, now created beauty instead of just struggling to survive. And his children, who had once eaten grass soup without complaint, were now helping to cook real meals and learning to appreciate the simple pleasure of sharing food as a family. As they ate together, sharing stories about their day and making plans for tomorrow's jobs, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The kind of peace that comes from knowing your children are safe, fed, and happy. The kind that comes from honest work and the satisfaction of building something meaningful. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. They were truly living. The morning sun cast long shadows across Arthur's expansive backyard as Ethan walked through the perfectly manicured garden. The sweet fragrance of blooming roses filled the air, mixing with the earthy scent of freshly turned soil. Arthur had asked him to come over early, before their usual morning routine of checking on client properties. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Arthur stood near his prized tomato plants, wearing his usual gardening attire, khaki pants, and a light blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. "It sure is," Ethan replied, noting how different things felt from those desperate days when he'd first met Arthur. Back then, he'd been boiling grass to feed his children. Now, his landscaping business was growing steadily, with a reliable client base and positive word of mouth spreading through the neighborhood. Arthur gestured toward a wooden bench beneath an old oak tree. "Let's sit for a moment, Ethan. There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Ethan's stomach tightened slightly. Even after all this time, he still felt a trace of his old insecurity when Arthur wanted to talk seriously. They sat down together, the morning dew still clinging to the grass around their feet. "Your work has been exceptional," Arthur began, his voice warm and sincere. "The way you've grown your business, how you handle our clients, it's impressive. But more than that, I've watched you grow as a person." Ethan shifted on the bench, uncomfortable with praise but learning to accept it. "It's all thanks to your guidance, Arthur. I wouldn't be here without your help." Arthur shook his head, a knowing smile on his face. "No, Ethan. You did the work. I just showed you the door. You walked through it yourself." He paused, looking out over his garden, "which is why I want to propose something to you." From his pocket, Arthur pulled out a folded document. "I want to offer you a partnership in my gardening business." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the document in Arthur's hands, his mind racing. "A partnership? But I don't understand." "Your business is already successful. Why would you want to partner with me?" Arthur's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "Because you bring something valuable to the table, Ethan. Your work ethic, your creativity with landscape design, your way with clients. These are all assets. But more than that, you understand what it means to build something from nothing." Ethan ran his hands through his hair, overwhelmed by the offer. "I don't know what to say, Arthur. It's too much." "Is it?" Arthur asked quietly. "Or is it your pride talking again?" The question hit home. Ethan remembered all the times his pride had almost cost him everything. How it had almost prevented him from accepting Arthur's help in the first place. How it had driven him to take that dangerous factory job instead of staying with the garden. "The business world can be lonely, Ethan," Arthur continued. "I've spent years building my empire. But what good is success if you can't share it? What I'm offering isn't charity. It's an investment in both our futures." A gentle breeze rustled through the oak leaves above them. In the distance, Ethan could hear the neighborhood coming to life. Cars starting, doors closing, children laughing as they headed to school. "The partnership would mean expanding our services," Arthur explained. "We could take on larger projects, hire more people, maybe even start a training program for others who need a second chance, just like you did." Ethan thought about his own journey. From boiling grass to feed his children to running his own successful landscaping business. He thought about how his kids now helped in the garden, how Mia had developed a passion for flowers, how Lucas could name every tool in the shed. "But what about your connection to Whole Foods?" Ethan asked. "Won't this seem small in comparison?" Arthur chuckled. "Whole Foods may be my business, but gardening is my passion. This partnership isn't about money, Ethan. It's about building something meaningful, something that can help others the way it helped you." Ethan looked down at his hands, calloused from years of hard work. These same hands had once trembled with shame as he served his children grass soup. Now they created beautiful gardens, transformed neglected yards into sanctuaries, built a future for his family. "I've learned so much from you, Arthur," Ethan said slowly. "Not just about gardening, but about life, about accepting help when it's offered, about the importance of community." Arthur nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's exactly why this partnership makes sense. Together, we can do more than either of us could do alone." Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. He thought about all the times he'd tried to do everything by himself, how his pride had kept him isolated and struggling. He thought about how much stronger he'd become since learning to accept help, to be part of something bigger than himself. "Yes," Ethan said finally, his voice firm and clear. "I'd be honored to be your partner, Arthur." Arthur's face lit up with genuine joy as he handed Ethan the partnership agreement. "I was hoping you'd say that. Welcome to the next chapter of your journey, partner." As they shook hands, Ethan felt something shift inside him, a final letting go of the old belief that success meant doing everything alone. Here, in this garden where his transformation had begun, he understood that true success wasn't measured by independence, but by the strength of the connections you built along the way. The early morning light painted golden streaks across the neighborhood as Ethan walked through his thriving garden. What had started as a small patch of desperate hope had blossomed into something magnificent. Rows of vegetables stretched in neat lines, their leaves dancing in the gentle breeze. The sweet fragrance of ripening tomatoes mingled with the earthy scent of fresh soil. 3 of his workers were already busy in different sections of the expanded garden. Maria, a single mother he'd hired last month, carefully harvested lettuce for their weekly farmer's market stand. Tom, who'd lost his job during the factory shutdown, tended to the herb section with practiced care. And young Kevin, barely out of high school, was learning the trade while maintaining the irrigation systems. Ethan's chest swelled with pride as he watched them work. Each person he'd hired had a story similar to his own, people who needed a chance, just like Arthur had given him. The memory of those desperate days, when he'd boiled grass to feed his children, felt like a lifetime ago. "Dad!" Mia's voice carried across the garden. She stood at the back door, her backpack slung over one shoulder. At 12 now, she carried herself with a confidence that made Ethan's heart soar. "We're heading to school early. I'm helping Mrs. Peterson with the garden club." Lucas appeared beside his sister, now 10, and already showing signs of becoming quite the entrepreneur himself. He'd started selling small potted herbs at the farmer's market, carefully reinvesting his profits just as Ethan had taught him. "That's great, sweetheart," Ethan called back. "Make sure you both eat the lunch I packed." The children's academic achievements had become the talk of the neighborhood. Mia had started a school garden club, teaching other kids what she'd learned from working alongside her father. Lucas had used his garden experience for a science project that won first place in the school fair. Ethan walked through the rows of vegetables, checking the ripeness of various crops. The morning dew still clung to the leaves, creating tiny rainbows in the strengthening sunlight. He stopped to help Maria with a particularly large head of lettuce. "My daughter got an A on her math test," Maria said, beaming with pride. "Those after-school study sessions with Mia really helped." "That's wonderful," Ethan replied, remembering how Arthur had taught him that success wasn't just about growing plants. It was about growing people, too. The garden had become more than just a business. It was a community hub where people came together, learned from each other, and built better lives. The weekly farmers market stand had expanded into a small storefront where they sold fresh produce and gardening supplies. They even offered classes on sustainable gardening practices, teaching others how to grow their own food. Tom approached with a clipboard, reviewing their delivery schedule for the day. "The restaurant orders are all packed and ready to go," he reported. "And that new cafe downtown wants to increase their weekly order." Ethan nodded, making mental notes. Their client list had grown steadily over the past few years, including several high-end restaurants that prized their organic, locally grown produce. The business had even started supplying fresh herbs and vegetables to the school cafeteria, ensuring children had access to healthy food, something that had been close to Ethan's heart since his own struggles. Kevin walked up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Mr. Reed, I think I fixed that leak in the irrigation system, and I've been studying those organic farming books you lent me." "Good work, Kevin," Ethan said, patting the young man's shoulder. He remembered himself at that age, too proud to accept help. Now, he understood the value of mentorship and community support. Walking toward the greenhouse Arthur had helped him build, Ethan paused to admire the experimental section where they tested new growing techniques. The aquaponics system was thriving, fish swimming lazily beneath floating beds of lettuce and herbs. Solar panels glinted on the roof, powering the pumps and fans, another suggestion from Arthur that had proved invaluable. Inside the greenhouse, the air was warm and humid. Seedlings for next season's crops were already sprouting in their trays. Each tiny green shoot represented hope and possibility. Ethan adjusted the temperature controls, checking the readings on the monitoring system they'd installed. Through the glass walls, he could see the neighborhood coming to life. Parents walked their children to school, many stopping to wave or call out greetings. Several carried bags of produce they'd bought from the store that morning. The sight of families having access to fresh, healthy food filled Ethan with a deep satisfaction. He stepped back outside, watching as his workers moved efficiently through their morning tasks. The business had grown enough that he could provide fair wages and benefits, something he'd insisted on from the start. He remembered too well what it was like to struggle making ends meet. The sound of a school bus rumbling past drew his attention. Through the fence, he could see children pressing their faces against the windows, pointing at the garden. The local schools now brought classes here for field trips, learning about sustainable agriculture and healthy eating. Mia and Lucas often helped with these tours, their knowledge and enthusiasm inspiring other kids. Moving to the center of the garden, Ethan paused at the original plot where it had all started, the small patch of earth where Arthur had first taught him to grow food for his family. That humble beginning had transformed into something extraordinary. The garden now covered nearly an acre, with plans for expansion already in the works. The morning sun had risen fully now, bathing the garden in warm light. Bees buzzed busily among the flowering plants. Birds sang in the fruit trees they'd planted along the borders, and butterflies danced between the rows of vegetables. The whole garden hummed with life and purpose. Standing amid the abundance, Ethan looked out over his flourishing garden. The neat rows of vegetables, the busy workers, the healthy soil, it was all testament to what could grow from a seed of hope. His gaze swept over the thriving ecosystem he'd helped create, knowing that each plant, each person, each small success was part of something larger. This garden had become more than just a means of survival. It was proof that with help, hard work, and hope, anything was possible. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the newly planted community garden. Ethan stood at its entrance, taking in the sight of dozens of people working together, tending to their plots. The space that had once been an empty lot was now transformed into a vibrant patchwork of gardens, each section telling its own story of hope and renewal. Arthur stood beside him, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, a gentle smile playing on his face. The older man's presence still brought a mix of emotions to Ethan: gratitude, respect, and a lingering touch of the pride that had once nearly cost him everything. "Look at what you've built, Ethan," Arthur said softly, gesturing to the bustling garden. Ethan shook his head. "What we've built," he corrected, watching as Maria taught a group of newcomers how to properly space their seedlings. Her own story of struggle mirrored his past. A single parent fighting to make ends meet. Now she managed the garden's education program, teaching others the skills that had changed her life. The sound of children's laughter drew his attention to the far corner where Lucas and Mia were leading a group of younger kids through the butterfly garden they'd designed themselves. His children had bloomed alongside the plants, growing from scared, hungry little ones into confident young people who understood the value of helping others. "Remember when you couldn't even look me in the eye?" Arthur chuckled, pulling Ethan from his thoughts. "I remember wanting to punch you when I found out who you really were," Ethan admitted with a laugh. The memory of discovering Arthur's true identity as the owner of Whole Foods no longer stung with embarrassment. Instead, it reminded him of how far he'd come from those days of desperate pride. Tom, one of his first employees, walked past with a wheelbarrow full of compost. He'd been another factory worker who'd lost everything. Now he ran the garden's sustainability program, teaching others how to create rich soil from kitchen scraps and yard waste. "Morning, boss," he called out cheerfully. "Just Ethan," he responded automatically, the word boss still feeling strange on his ears. He watched as Tom joined Kevin, the young apprentice who reminded Ethan so much of himself at that age, full of determination but unsure of his path. The garden had become more than just a place to grow food. It was a sanctuary where people could rebuild their lives, just as he had. Every corner held a story of transformation. The herb section, managed by elderly Mrs. Rodriguez, provided both fresh ingredients and traditional remedies to the community. The vegetable plots fed families who had once relied on food banks. The flower gardens, tended by local schoolchildren, brought beauty and pollinators to the space. "I was so afraid of accepting help," Ethan said quietly, watching as more community members arrived for the day's activities. "I thought it made me weak, made me less of a father." Arthur nodded thoughtfully. "Pride can be the heaviest burden we carry. I remember that grass soup," Ethan continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Telling my kids it was special when really I was just trying to fill their stomachs with something, anything. I thought I had to do everything alone." A group of women gathered near the community kitchen, preparing for the day's cooking class. The kitchen had been Arthur's idea, a place where people could learn to prepare the food they grew, sharing recipes and stories across cultures and generations. The aroma of fresh herbs and baking bread wafted through the air, so different from the desperate meals of Ethan's past. "The garden taught me something important," Ethan said, watching as Mia demonstrated proper watering techniques to some younger children. "It showed me that growth isn't just about the plants. It's about people, about community." His landscaping business had expanded beyond his wildest dreams, but it wasn't the success that filled him with pride. It was the lives he'd touched, the families he'd helped, the community he'd helped build. Every person who found hope in the garden was a reminder of his own journey. Lucas ran past with a watering can, carefully tending to the seedlings he'd helped plant. The boy who had once quietly accepted grass soup now confidently taught others about organic growing methods. Mia had developed a program to help other kids learn about nutrition and gardening, her natural leadership abilities shining through. "You know what amazes me most?" Ethan asked, turning to Arthur. "It's not how much the garden has grown or how successful the business has become. It's how much my kids have grown. They understand something I didn't at their age, that true strength comes from lifting others up, not pushing them away." The morning sun climbed higher, illuminating the garden in its full glory. Raised beds burst with vegetables, trellises climbed with vines, and flowers bobbed their colorful heads in the breeze. But more beautiful than the plants were the people. Neighbors helping neighbors, strangers becoming friends, a community growing stronger together. "I was wrong about what success meant," Ethan continued, watching as more families arrived for the day's activities. "I thought it was about having enough money, about not needing anyone's help. But real success is this, creating something that helps others grow." He remembered the day Arthur had revealed his true identity, how that moment had nearly driven him away. Now he understood that Arthur's wealth had never been about the money. It was about what he chose to do with it, how he used it to help others find their own path. The garden hummed with activity as the morning progressed. New members were being shown their plots, children learned about composting, and the community kitchen prepared for another day of shared meals and learning. Each person there had their own story, their own journey from struggle to growth. Mia and Lucas waved from their butterfly garden, their faces glowing with enthusiasm as they shared their knowledge with younger children. The sight filled Ethan's heart with joy, not because they were successful, but because they understood what truly mattered. "They get it," Ethan said softly. They understand that this garden isn't just about growing food. It's about growing hope. The evening sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple as Ethan stood on his front porch, the wooden boards beneath his feet no longer creaking like they used to. He'd fixed them himself last summer, one of the many repairs he'd made to the house that was now truly becoming a home. Arthur stood beside him, both men leaning against the newly installed railing, sharing a comfortable silence as they watched the day wind down. "You know," Ethan said, breaking the quiet, "I never thought I'd be here." He gestured to the flourishing garden that spread out before them, neat rows of vegetables and flowers, creating a tapestry of colors. "A year ago, I was boiling grass for my kids' dinner." Arthur nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Sometimes the hardest moments in our lives lead us to exactly where we need to be." He pulled out an old, worn photograph from his pocket and handed it to Ethan. "This was my first store, just a tiny place, hardly bigger than your garden shed." Ethan studied the faded image of a much younger Arthur standing proudly in front of a small storefront. The sign above the door read Montgomery's Fresh Foods in simple lettering. "Hard to believe this turned into Whole Foods," Ethan mused. "The money, the empire, none of that matters as much as what we're doing right here," Arthur said, gesturing to the community garden visible just beyond Ethan's yard. "Look at how many families we're helping now." The community garden had become a sanctuary for struggling families in the neighborhood. Every evening, people gathered there to tend their plots, share stories, and learn from each other. Children played between the rows, while their parents harvested vegetables or planted new seeds. "You gave me more than just gardening tips," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "You showed me that success isn't about doing everything alone." Arthur chuckled softly. "And you taught me something too, Ethan. Watching you with your children, seeing how hard you fought for them, it reminded me why I started my business in the first place. It was never about building an empire. It was about feeding people, bringing communities together." From the garden came the sound of children's laughter. Mia was showing Lucas how to harvest carrots, their hands covered in rich soil. The sight made Ethan's heart swell with pride. His children no longer looked hungry or worried. They were flourishing, just like the plants they tended. "Remember when you first told me who you really were?" Ethan asked, shaking his head at the memory. "I was so angry. I thought you were mocking me. And now? Now I understand why you kept it quiet. You wanted to help without your wealth getting in the way." Ethan turned to face his mentor and friend. "You wanted me to learn to stand on my own feet." The landscaping business had grown beyond Ethan's wildest dreams. What started as a simple garden had blossomed into a successful enterprise that employed several local residents. But more importantly, it had given Ethan something he'd lost long ago: his dignity. "Your children are different now," Arthur observed, watching as Mia and Lucas carefully placed their harvested vegetables in baskets. "They carry themselves with confidence." "They're not afraid anymore," Ethan agreed. "They know we'll have food on the table. They know their dad can take care of them." He paused, correcting himself. "That we can take care of each other." The sunset cast long shadows across the garden, but the day's work wasn't quite done. Several families were still tending their plots, sharing tools and advice. The sense of community was palpable, a stark contrast to the isolation Ethan had felt just a year ago. "You know what makes me proudest?" Ethan asked, his eyes following his children as they moved through the garden. "It's not the business success or even being able to provide. It's seeing them help others. Mia's teaching the younger kids about planting. Lucas shares his lunch with anyone who needs it." Arthur smiled warmly. "They learned that from you, Ethan. Your strength wasn't just in surviving, it was in maintaining your humanity through the hardest times." A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers and rich earth. The garden that had started as a desperate measure had transformed into something beautiful and sustaining. But beyond the physical transformation, Ethan knew the real change had happened within himself and his family. "I used to think success meant never needing help," Ethan admitted. "Now I know it's about building something together, about lifting each other up." The last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a golden glow over the garden. Mia and Lucas had finished their harvesting and were now playing among the flowers, their laughter carrying across the yard. They were carefree and happy, exactly as children should be. Ethan felt a deep sense of peace settle over him as he watched them. The worry lines that had once seemed permanently etched on his face had softened, The weight of constant struggle had lifted from his shoulders. In its place was something he hadn't felt in years: hope. He looked at his children, their faces bright with joy as they chased each other through the garden paths. This was what success truly looked like. Not a number in a bank account or a prestigious title, but the sound of children's laughter and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another day of growth, both in the garden and in their hearts. This was his legacy. Not just the thriving business or the beautiful garden, but the lessons of resilience, community, and love that his children would carry forward. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that his journey had led him exactly where he needed to be. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Ethan Reed, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.